When we speak of the Renaissance, we typically conjure images of noble humanists graciously rediscovering classical wisdom, of artists pursuing pure beauty, of scholars dedicated to truth. But this sanitized version bears little resemblance to the actual Renaissance, a period marked by extraordinary human achievement built upon foundations of ruthless ambition, religious upheaval, and moral contradiction. The real Renaissance wasn't the serene awakening our textbooks describe, but a tumultuous explosion of human energy that reveals as much about human vice as virtue. What emerges when we strip away the romantic mythology is something far more complex, far more human, and infinitely more instructive for understanding our own age. The Renaissance succeeded not because it transcended human nature, but because it channeled that nature, with all its contradictions, toward unprecedented creative heights. Today, as we witness our own cultural upheaval, the Renaissance offers sobering lessons about the price of progress and the eternal tension between achievement and virtue. Chapter 1: The Myth of Noble Humanism. The greatest deception about the Renaissance lies in its very name, rebirth, which suggests a spontaneous resurrection of classical learning after centuries of medieval darkness. This narrative, crafted by Renaissance intellectuals themselves and perpetuated by modern academics, fundamentally misrepresents both medieval achievement and Renaissance motivation. The medieval period had never truly lost classical learning. Monasteries preserved ancient texts, universities studied Aristotle, and scholars like Thomas Aquinas synthesized Christian theology with Greek philosophy. What changed in the 14th and 15th centuries wasn't the availability of classical texts, but the uses to which ambitious men put them. The so-called humanists weren't disinterested scholars pursuing truth for its own sake. They were, more often than not, ambitious courtiers seeking advancement through displays of erudition. Petrarch, often hailed as the father of humanism, spent his career flattering various patrons and positioning himself as the supreme arbiter of classical taste. His famous discovery of Cicero's letters wasn't an archaeological triumph but a calculated move to establish his credentials as the leading classical scholar of his age. These humanists understood that knowledge was power, and they wielded their learning as weapons in the brutal competition for patronage and prestige that characterized Renaissance courts. Consider the career of Francesco Filelfo, one of the most prominent humanists of the 15th century. He mastered Greek and Latin, translated important texts, and cultivated an impressive scholarly reputation. Yet his correspondence reveals a man consumed by petty jealousies, constantly scheming against rivals, and shamelessly flattering wealthy patrons. When the Medici family fell from power in Florence, Filelfo immediately switched allegiances, composing vicious attacks on his former benefactors. His scholarship, however genuine, served primarily as a tool for social climbing and political maneuvering. Far from representing a pure love of learning, Renaissance humanism was thoroughly contaminated by worldly ambition. Scholars didn't retire to ivory towers, they hustled for positions as secretaries, tutors, and cultural advisors to princes whose hands were often stained with blood. The revival of classical learning served political ends, providing intellectual justification for the ruthless pragmatism that characterized Renaissance statecraft. When Lorenzo Valla demonstrated that the donation of Constantine was a forgery, he wasn't pursuing abstract truth but serving his patrons' political interests in challenging papal territorial claims. The humanist movement's greatest irony lay in how it simultaneously celebrated human dignity while serving masters who treated human life as expendable. Lorenzo Valla could write eloquently about the worth of the individual while working for Pope Nicholas V, who authorized the use of torture in the Inquisition. The very scholars who proclaimed the nobility of human reason often found themselves crafting elegant justifications for their patrons' most brutal acts. This wasn't coincidence but necessity. In a world where intellectual life depended entirely on patronage, survival required moral flexibility that would have scandalized the ancient Romans these humanists claimed to revere. Chapter 2: The Brutal Reality Behind Artistic Beauty. The magnificent art we associate with the Renaissance emerged not from serene contemplation but from intense competition, financial desperation, and the raw ambition of artists determined to escape poverty and achieve immortality. Behind every masterpiece lies a story of human struggle that our romantic notions of artistic genius typically obscure. Michelangelo didn't lie on his back painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling because he felt inspired by divine beauty. He did it because Pope Julius II commanded it, and refusing a papal commission meant professional and possibly physical destruction. The workshop system that produced Renaissance art was essentially a brutal apprenticeship designed to break young men's spirits before rebuilding them as skilled craftsmen. Boys as young as 10 were bound to masters who worked them relentlessly, often for years without payment. Many never survived to become independent artists. Those who did emerged hardened by experience, understanding that artistic achievement required not just talent but cunning, persistence, and the ability to manage difficult patrons whose tastes often ran toward the vulgar or politically expedient. Consider Leonardo da Vinci, whose reputation for leaving works unfinished reflected not artistic temperament but the practical realities of Renaissance life. Patrons died, political situations changed, and payments stopped arriving. Leonardo learned to hedge his bets, working simultaneously for multiple employers and developing military engineering skills alongside his artistic talents. His famous notebooks reveal a mind obsessed not just with beauty but with practical problems of warfare, fortification, and mechanical advantage. The same hand that sketched the Mona Lisa also designed instruments of torture and siege engines. The violence inherent in Renaissance society permeated artistic production in ways we rarely acknowledge. Cellini's autobiography reads like a crime novel, filled with murders, duels, and narrow escapes from justice. Caravaggio killed a man during a tennis match and spent his final years as a fugitive, painting some of his greatest works while dodging assassins. These weren't exceptions but representative examples of how artistic achievement emerged from lives shaped by constant danger and moral compromise. The patronage system itself corrupted artistic vision in subtle but profound ways. Artists learned to anticipate their patrons' preferences, often incorporating flattery and political propaganda into works ostensibly devoted to religious or mythological themes. The Medici family appears in countless religious paintings as saints and angels, while their enemies are depicted as demons and villains. Art became a sophisticated form of public relations, beautiful but tainted by the circumstances of its creation. Even the greatest masters couldn't escape these constraints. Raphael's Vatican frescoes celebrate papal power with the same skill he brought to devotional works. Michelangelo's David, supposedly a symbol of republican virtue, was strategically placed to intimidate the enemies of Florentine independence. The beauty these works possess is real, but it emerged from calculations that had little to do with pure aesthetic vision. Most tragic of all was how this system encouraged artists to view their own work as commodity rather than calling. The Renaissance produced magnificent individual pieces while systematically destroying the communal traditions that had sustained medieval craftsmanship. Artists learned to compete rather than collaborate, to jealously guard their techniques rather than freely share knowledge. The pursuit of individual fame replaced the anonymous devotion that had built the great cathedrals, creating a more brilliant but less stable foundation for artistic culture. Chapter 3: Faith, Power, and the Corruption of Truth. The Renaissance relationship with Christianity reveals the period's fundamental character more clearly than any other aspect of its achievement. This was an age when popes led armies, collected pagan art, and fathered children while simultaneously claiming divine authority over human souls. The synthesis of classical learning with Christian faith, often presented as the Renaissance's greatest intellectual achievement, actually represented a profound corruption of both traditions that would have horrified their original adherents. Pope Julius II, Michelangelo's patron, spent more time planning military campaigns than contemplating scripture. Known as the warrior pope, he personally led troops into battle while wearing full armor over his papal vestments. His successor, Leo X, famously remarked that, "God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," then proceeded to bankrupt the papal treasury through lavish spending on art, entertainment, and his own family's advancement. These men understood that spiritual authority provided the perfect cover for temporal ambition, and they exploited this understanding with breathtaking cynicism. The intellectual justification for this corruption came through the humanist revival of classical moral philosophy, particularly Stoicism and Aristotelianism, which provided alternative ethical frameworks that could be selectively applied when Christian morality proved inconvenient. Scholars developed increasingly sophisticated arguments for why Christian principles needed practical modification in the real world of politics and diplomacy. This intellectual flexibility allowed Renaissance leaders to maintain the forms of Christian faith while gutting its substance, creating a hollow spirituality that served worldly ends. Consider the career of Cardinal Pietro Bembo, who combined genuine classical scholarship with shameless pursuit of ecclesiastical preferment. He wrote elegant treatises on Platonic love while maintaining a notorious affair that produced 3 children. His literary work celebrated spiritual transcendence while his actions revealed thorough worldliness. Bembo represents the Renaissance genius for compartmentalization, the ability to hold contradictory beliefs and behaviors in perfect intellectual equilibrium. The corruption extended beyond individual hypocrisy to systematic perversion of Christian institutions. The papal court became indistinguishable from any secular court, complete with elaborate ceremonials, political intrigue, and sexual scandal. Cardinals purchased their positions through bribery, then used their offices to enrich their families and fund their luxurious lifestyles. The very men charged with preserving Christian teaching actively undermined it through their example. Perhaps most damaging was how Renaissance culture gradually separated beauty from truth, treating aesthetic achievement as independent of moral worth. Churches filled with magnificent art that celebrated pagan themes while Christian teaching was reduced to empty formulas. The visual splendor of Renaissance Christianity concealed its spiritual poverty, creating a shell of religious observance without authentic religious content. The tragic irony is that genuine religious reform was desperately needed, but the intellectual tools that might have provided it were instead used to justify existing corruptions. When reformers like Savonarola attempted to call the Church back to authentic Christian practice, they were destroyed by the very humanist scholars who should have supported them. The Renaissance preference for classical over biblical sources meant that moral criticism was directed toward abstract philosophical questions rather than concrete Christian obligations. This diversion of intellectual energy from religious reform to classical speculation contributed directly to the crisis that would eventually tear Christian Europe apart in the Reformation. Chapter 4: The Intellectuals' Betrayal of Principle. The Renaissance produced the first recognizable modern intellectuals, men who claimed authority based on their learning rather than birth, wealth, or religious office. Yet these same individuals demonstrated with startling consistency how quickly intellectual achievement could corrupt moral judgment when divorced from transcendent accountability. The patterns they established would echo through subsequent centuries, reaching their nadir in the 20th century's ideological disasters, though their Renaissance origins remain largely unrecognized. Niccolò Machiavelli represents the archetype of this intellectual corruption. Presenting himself as a dispassionate political scientist, he crafted arguments that systematically undermined traditional moral constraints on political action. The Prince wasn't merely descriptive analysis but prescriptive advice for how rulers could maintain power through calculated brutality. Machiavelli's genius lay in making vice appear virtuous by framing moral questions in purely practical terms. His intellectual sophistication served to legitimize behavior that simpler men would have recognized as straightforwardly evil. The humanist movement produced scores of similar figures, scholars who used their learning to dissolve rather than strengthen moral boundaries. Poggio Bracciolini discovered important classical manuscripts while simultaneously composing pornographic literature that would have shocked the pagans whose works he preserved. Marsilio Ficino translated Plato's dialogues while practicing astrology and magic that contradicted both Christian and classical teachings. These men understood that their scholarly reputations gave them license to explore ideas and behaviors that would have been forbidden to less educated individuals. The tragedy wasn't that these intellectuals lacked moral knowledge; their classical sources contained abundant wisdom about virtue and vice. Rather, they deliberately chose to emphasize those aspects of ancient thought that justified their patrons' desires while ignoring teachings that would have constrained them. This selective reading of tradition represented a fundamental betrayal of the scholarly vocation, transforming what should have been a tool for moral clarity into an instrument of sophisticated self-deception. The Renaissance pioneered the peculiarly modern phenomenon of highly educated individuals using their intelligence to rationalize behavior they knew to be wrong. Humanist scholars developed elaborate theories about how exceptional individuals could transcend conventional moral limitations, anticipating arguments that would later justify totalitarian excesses. Their classical learning provided vocabulary for this corruption, but the corruption itself emerged from abandoning the transcendent moral foundations that both Christian and pagan traditions had acknowledged. Consider how Renaissance intellectuals handled the question of tyranny. Classical authors had unanimously condemned it, and Christian teaching reinforced these judgments. Yet humanist scholars found ways to redefine tyranny out of existence when it served their purposes. They distinguished between tyrants and strong rulers, between justified and unjustified violence, between necessary and unnecessary deception. These distinctions might appear sophisticated, but they actually represented moral cowardice dressed up as intellectual subtlety. The corruption proved contagious because it appealed to human pride. Renaissance intellectuals convinced themselves and others that superior education justified moral flexibility. This argument would resurface whenever educated elites sought to exempt themselves from standards they imposed on others. The 20th century's ideological catastrophes began with intellectuals who believed their theoretical sophistication exempted them from practical moral constraints, a belief whose origins trace directly to Renaissance humanism. Chapter 5: Patterns that Echo Through Time. The Renaissance established templates for cultural development that continue to shape our world today, though we rarely recognize their origins or understand their implications. The period's combination of technological innovation, artistic achievement, and moral decay created a blueprint that would be repeated whenever societies experience rapid material progress divorced from spiritual grounding. Understanding these patterns provides essential guidance for navigating our own cultural challenges, particularly as America faces similar pressures of technological disruption and cultural transformation. The Renaissance democratization of learning through printing created the first modern information explosion, and with it, the first modern information crisis. As books became cheaper and more abundant, readers faced the unprecedented challenge of choosing between competing authorities and conflicting interpretations of truth. The result wasn't enlightenment but confusion, as people lost the shared frameworks that had previously provided intellectual coherence. This breakdown of consensus created opportunities for demagogues and ideologues to exploit public uncertainty, a dynamic that would prove disastrously familiar in later centuries and bears unmistakable resemblance to our current digital age. Renaissance city-states pioneered modern techniques of propaganda and public manipulation that would eventually be perfected by totalitarian movements. Rulers discovered that controlling public narrative was more effective than controlling public behavior, and they employed humanist scholars to craft sophisticated justifications for their policies. The same intellectual tools that created great literature also produced refined techniques of mass deception. This wasn't accidental but inevitable. Once learning became separated from moral accountability, it naturally gravitated toward serving power rather than truth. The period's economic innovations established patterns of financial manipulation that would echo through subsequent centuries. The Medici banking system created new forms of credit and debt that enabled unprecedented capital accumulation while also generating unprecedented instability. Renaissance merchants pioneered accounting techniques that could disguise losses and exaggerate profits, laying groundwork for financial scandals that would recur whenever monetary sophistication outpaced moral restraint. The period's artistic achievements came at the cost of broader cultural stability, establishing a pattern where creative elites became increasingly divorced from the communities that supported them. As artists competed for the favor of wealthy patrons, they gradually lost connection with traditional sources of meaning and moral guidance. This dynamic produced magnificent individual works while contributing to the breakdown of cultural coherence that would eventually require violent correction through religious and political upheaval. Perhaps most significantly, the Renaissance demonstrated how intellectual and artistic achievement could flourish while moral and spiritual foundations eroded. This created a false confidence that human creativity was self-sustaining, independent of transcendent sources of meaning and purpose. The illusion persisted until the Reformation shattered it, revealing how completely the period's apparent stability depended on inherited but increasingly hollow traditions. The Renaissance thus established the modern pattern of cultural boom followed by moral bust, of material progress accompanied by spiritual regress. Each subsequent repetition of this cycle, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the 20th century's ideological experiments, followed templates first established in Renaissance Italy. Understanding these patterns helps explain why periods of apparent human advancement so often culminate in catastrophe, and why lasting achievement requires moral as well as material foundations. Chapter 6: Providence in Human Affairs. The Renaissance's ultimate meaning emerges not from human intention but from patterns that transcend individual planning or understanding. While participants pursued immediate goals of wealth, fame, and power, their collective efforts produced consequences none of them anticipated or desired. This gap between human intention and historical outcome reveals the operation of forces beyond mere human agency, forces that traditional Christians would recognize as providence working through even flawed human instruments to accomplish purposes larger than any individual comprehension. The period's artistic achievements outlasted the political systems that produced them, suggesting that beauty and truth possess inherent staying power that transcends their immediate circumstances. Michelangelo's Pietà continues to move viewers centuries after the Medici banking empire collapsed, and the architectural marvels of Renaissance Florence retain their power to inspire long after the city-state that commissioned them lost its independence. This persistence of artistic and intellectual achievement across political catastrophe indicates that human creativity, however corrupted by immediate circumstances, serves purposes larger than its creators understood. The moral failures of Renaissance leadership, rather than undermining divine justice, actually demonstrated its operation through apparently secular events. Pope Alexander VI's corruption didn't go unpunished, his dynasty collapsed within decades, and his reputation became a permanent warning against papal worldliness. The Borgia family's temporary triumph gave way to lasting disgrace, while genuinely holy figures like Thomas More achieved immortal honor despite suffering temporal defeat. These reversals follow patterns too consistent to be merely coincidental. The Renaissance's intellectual achievements, even when motivated by worldly ambition, contributed to human understanding in ways their creators never intended. Humanist scholarship, despite its moral compromises, preserved classical texts that might otherwise have been lost. Artistic innovations driven by competitive pride produced techniques that would serve future generations committed to more worthy purposes. Even Machiavelli's cynical political analysis inadvertently demonstrated the bankruptcy of purely secular approaches to human governance. The Protestant Reformation emerged directly from Renaissance corruption, as reformers reacted against the cynical manipulation of spiritual authority for temporal ends. Luther's revolt succeeded precisely because Renaissance popes had so thoroughly discredited themselves through their worldly behavior. What appeared to be religious catastrophe was actually necessary correction, forcing Christianity to rediscover authentic spiritual foundations that had been obscured by humanist sophistication. The seeming disaster thus served larger purposes of purification and renewal that individual participants neither intended nor understood. The Renaissance's scientific achievements, though often motivated by magical thinking and astrological superstition, laid groundwork for more rigorous investigation of natural phenomena. Copernicus's astronomical theories emerged from Hermetic philosophy, but they pointed toward mathematical truths that transcended their immediate intellectual context. The same pattern appears throughout Renaissance innovation. Human error and insight intermingled in ways that served truth despite their creator's limitations. Perhaps most remarkably, the Renaissance's very excesses created their own correction by making moral bankruptcy visible and therefore resistible. The period's intellectual sophistication could not indefinitely disguise the practical consequences of abandoning transcendent moral standards. Eventually, reality reasserted itself through historical events that no amount of humanist eloquence could rationalize away. This self-correcting tendency suggests that truth possesses inherent power to expose and defeat even the most sophisticated forms of deception. Chapter 7: Lessons for Our Contemporary Crisis. Our current cultural moment bears striking resemblances to the Renaissance crisis of authority and meaning, making the period's lessons particularly urgent for contemporary America. We face similar challenges of technological disruption, intellectual confusion, and moral relativism, though on a vastly larger scale. Understanding how the Renaissance navigated these difficulties, and where it failed, provides essential guidance for our own cultural choices, particularly as we witness the breakdown of institutions and traditions that have sustained American civilization for centuries. The Renaissance taught that intellectual achievement without moral grounding inevitably serves corrupt ends, regardless of its practitioners' stated intentions. Our contemporary academic and media establishments have repeated this pattern with depressing precision, using sophisticated analytical tools to rationalize positions that violate common sense and traditional wisdom. The solution isn't anti-intellectualism but intellectual humility, recognizing that learning must serve truth rather than power, and that truth itself requires transcendent foundations that purely human reason cannot provide. Renaissance city-states pioneered techniques of social manipulation that modern technology has amplified beyond their creators' wildest dreams. Today's information environment, dominated by algorithms designed to maximize engagement rather than promote understanding, creates opportunities for deception that dwarf anything Renaissance propagandists could achieve. Yet the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Sophisticated techniques applied without moral constraints inevitably corrupt both those who use them and those who consume their products. Recovery requires recovering traditional virtues of intellectual honesty and moral courage that recognize truth as more important than immediate advantage. The Renaissance pattern of artistic achievement divorced from moral foundation appears clearly in contemporary American culture, where technical sophistication coexists with spiritual emptiness. Our entertainment industry possesses unprecedented technical capabilities but consistently produces content that undermines the values necessary for civilization's survival. The solution isn't cultural puritanism but cultural discrimination, learning to distinguish between achievement that serves human flourishing and achievement that merely displays technical skill. Renaissance financial innovations that prioritized short-term profit over long-term stability echo through contemporary American economic life, where complex financial instruments often serve to obscure rather than clarify actual value. The same intellectual pride that led Renaissance bankers to believe they had transcended traditional limitations appears in modern financial engineering that treats mathematical sophistication as a substitute for moral restraint. Recovery requires returning to economic principles that recognize moral as well as material obligations. The Renaissance breakdown of religious authority through institutional corruption parallels contemporary challenges facing American Christianity, where scandal and compromise have undermined moral credibility. Yet the Protestant Reformation demonstrated that institutional failure can prompt spiritual renewal when believers return to foundational sources of truth rather than doubling down on failed compromises. Contemporary American Christianity possesses resources for similar renewal if it chooses authenticity over respectability. The Renaissance ultimately succeeded where it maintained connections to transcendent sources of meaning and failed where it severed those connections. American civilization possesses resources for renewal that Renaissance Europe lacked: a constitutional framework designed to constrain power, religious traditions that resist purely secular interpretation, and cultural memories of successful self-government based on virtue rather than mere cleverness. These advantages create opportunities for avoiding Renaissance mistakes while preserving Renaissance achievements, but only if we choose wisdom over sophistication and character over mere talent. Most importantly, the Renaissance demonstrated that periods of apparent cultural triumph often contain seeds of their own destruction when they abandon transcendent moral standards. Our contemporary moment offers similar warnings disguised as unprecedented opportunities. The choice before us mirrors the choice that faced Renaissance figures, whether to use our considerable advantages to serve purposes larger than ourselves, or to squander them in pursuit of immediate gratification and worldly success. Conclusion. The Renaissance's true lesson isn't that human achievement requires moral compromise, but that lasting achievement demands moral foundation. The period's greatest works endured because they served truth and beauty rather than mere power and ambition. Its failures warn us that intellectual sophistication without spiritual grounding leads inevitably to corruption and catastrophe. Today's Americans inherit both Renaissance achievements and Renaissance temptations. We can choose to repeat its mistakes or learn from its failures. The choice, as always in human affairs, comes down to character, whether we will use our considerable advantages to serve purposes larger than ourselves, or squander them in pursuit of immediate gratification. History suggests that civilizations, like individuals, cannot long survive the systematic violation of moral law, regardless of how eloquently they justify their transgressions. The Renaissance demonstrated both the heights human creativity can achieve and the depths to which it can sink when unmoored from transcendent truth. Our response to this legacy will determine whether American civilization follows the path of renewal or repetition, whether we learn from history's lessons or become another cautionary tale for future generations to study.